Welcome to Global Fact 8. This is our third session of the day, and fact checkers around the globe are working hard to fight disinformation. In this session, we'll be fighting disinformation through public policy. That's what we'll be exploring, and also European fact checkers finding their voice. My name's Glen Tarman. I'm the head of policy and advocacy for Full Fact in the UK, and I'm very pleased to be your moderator today. Let me introduce you to our panel and give you an outline of how this session will work. And our panel today is Jelena Berkovic, Senior Advisor at Faktograf, the fact-checking website in Croatia. Also with us is Hernández-Echevarría, Head of Public Policy and Institutional Development at Maldita in Spain. And with us also is Owen Bennett, Senior Policy Manager at the Mozilla Corporation based in Brussels. You're all very welcome. In this session, we're going to explore the current policy debates and regulation that will significantly affect the operating environment for European fact checkers at least, and in particular the Digital Services Act, or the DSA as it's widely known, and the upcoming Code of Practice on Disinformation, or rather the next version thereof. We're going to do this in three parts. In a moment, we'll kick off with a few minutes of opening remarks from each of our panelists to help us orient around the issues and what's at stake. In a second section, Carlos and Jelena will share with us some findings of a policy survey of European fact-checking organisations, both from within EU member states and beyond. And this will give some insights into how our community are approaching public policy and the regulatory issues at this critical time, a time when EU policymakers are signalling that they are prepared to tackle, and let's hope they really are, they are prepared to tackle the crises around misinformation and disinformation. And we'll come back in a third part to look further at the state of play, what's next on the DSA and the code, and including some of your questions. So we'd really like you to post your questions in the Q&A as we go. We'll get to some as we go along, as well as some in that final section I've just spoken about. So without further ado, let's get into our content and hear from each of our panelists in turn, which will be Carlos, then Jelena, and then Owen. So what, in your view, what do we need to know about what's in play and what's the influencing agenda for us? We'll start with you, Carlos. Over to you.
Well, I think there's so many things in play. I think all of us, and I don't need to tell this to any fact checker because they already know, but obviously there's not going to be any magical solution to this information, not coming from us or the platforms or even public authorities. There's not going to be a miracle that ends everything for the better. But there's so many things that we could be doing. And when we engage with public authorities and lawmakers, and there are so many of them that have really good intentions, I mean, that they wish to do something good for, or more precisely against disinformation, and having a more healthy public debate about policy and everything, but they just don't know how. And sometimes with the best of intentions, they fail and they suggest things that might sound well on paper, but the results can actually be terrible. So I think that's a very powerful reason for us to get involved in this kind of policy discussions, and also for us to kind of to step up to the plate and say, well, this is what we know, this is what we learned from our daily jobs, and this is how we sometimes can say, well, this idea is pretty terrible, because sometimes it's not about even what is being done. Sometimes it's also about, no, please do not do that. That's a policy job. So that could be thing. Also, we are in the midst of a conversation. We are at a moment that, as you were saying very rightly, that this is a very important moment. Regulation is going forward, whether we like it or not. And we need to be able to be there in that conversation, in the room, to say the things that we feel can actually work and not. Because other actors are much more powerful than us. They have more resources. They are more savvy in the sense that they have been influencing public debates for a long time. They have bigger lobbies because we don't have any. So that's why we need to be involved in this conversation, because what we are confronting is huge. Regulations are going to be made, whether we like it or not. So at the very least, let's try together to find a voice and influence that what it's actually done, it serves a purpose and it's not like a waste of time.
Thank you so much, Carlos. We'll move over to Jelena. I'll come back with some questions in follow-up.
Well, let me provide a bit of a context why we decided to organize such a panel. Because for me, this is like a very steep learning period to find out what the EU is actually planning. Basically, the internet has not been regulated, and now the EU is trying to do something about it, and fact checkers are going to be impacted. Everything's going to happen with or without us being actively participating in this. So when we started discussing this, we were all very much aware that journalism on the whole globally is, well, the pandemic might be a media extinction event, right? And it might have very bad consequences on democracies around the world. But specifically within the journalistic field, fact-checking seems to be blooming. Well, we have some data on this later, and blooming in the sense of knowledge and the growth of self-publishing journalistic organizations that are specialized in fact-checking. At the same time, disinformation is being spread, boosted by technologies beyond borders, specifically beyond EU borders, coming from Croatia. Disinformation without language barriers moves around the neighborhood, which is not necessarily EU member states, but candidates and aspiring. So when we in Southeastern Europe, with our partners from our C-Check network, discuss how to fight disinformation and misinformation and how to systematically approach those issues through policies as well, we really need to look at what the EU is planning. So therefore, if we have in mind the changes that were done, not planned, but all over the world, thanks to the GDPR that was introduced by the EU, for us now, it's not a question of if or should we participate, but rather how. And let's discuss the resources, and like Claire Wardle mentioned at the start of the conference, what we as fact checkers need to do to prepare us for the very intensive road that's already being run by so many other stakeholders, that we need to learn quite a lot about.
Thank you, Jelena. Over to you, Owen.
Great, thank you. I'll try not to repeat too much of what already has been said, because I won't do justice to the good intervention so far. Maybe one thing I will try to underscore, because I think it is really important for this conversation, is just how transformative the DSA is going to be, and why that is so pertinent and relevant to questions around fact-checking and the role of the fact-checking community, both within those policy debates, but also just in terms of fulfilling their own role and mission. And what's really interesting and empowering about the DSA, and something that made us as Mozilla so interested in getting involved in that process, is that it's really transforming the way in which we think about online content and the way in which we think about online platforms' responsibility for the content that they host. And Carlos made a really good point earlier about trying to stop bad interventions, and trying to ensure that when lawmakers do things that are well intentioned, that those things actually have the desired impact. And one way in which we're seeing a really kind of positive transformation is that the debate around online content, particularly around misinformation and so forth, it's moving away from this whack-a-mole idea where there is just lots of bad content out there. We just need to do a better job of fact-checking it and getting rid of it. And if we just keep on spending more and more money, eventually we'll have solved the content problem. And what's really good about the DSA is it tries to move beyond that paradigm and thinks, well, this is not just about content being up or content coming down, but really it's about the way in which online services interact with content and the ways in which they shape online information experiences and online information ecosystems. And so in that sense, I think there's a really, really important role for fact checkers to play in that debate, because when we start thinking about regulation as behavioral regulation, looking at companies like Facebook and saying, what is their responsibility for the information ecosystem. That is where it is really important to have fact checkers' perspectives in the debate, because fact checkers are at the front line of that conversation and that effort to ensure a healthier information ecosystem. And I'm sure that, like, over the course of this conference, we have already heard, and we will hear even more examples of the way in which those kind of mechanisms for collaboration on behalf of platforms can be improved. And then the second and very quick final point I would make in terms of the importance of fact checker engagement is just to simply inform policymakers of the kind of interventions that work and the kind of interventions that, while well-intentioned, are not effective at enhancing the quality of information discourse online. So sorry, I'll stop because I don't want to go too far over.
Great. Well, let's circle back then maybe with Carlos and Jelena to, I wondered if you could just explain a little bit of what the DSA is intending and what are the issues and areas that are most likely to impact on fact checkers or the world information environment that we'd like to see. For those in Europe who are not so familiar or maybe need that reminder, and for those who are outside Europe who may have similar kind of moves happening as well. And between you, Carlos and Jelena, if you might also touch on the code, what's happening there? Why should we be interested in it?
I guess we'll try to do a good job of summarizing a very complicated thing, but yeah, the Digital Services Act is actually Europe's, plan to kind of regulate the internet after being 20 years of having an internet directive that was, written when Facebook didn't exist. Alta Vista had more, more users than Google, and it was a different time. So we went into this knowing that the European Commission had made fighting this and misinformation a core of this Digital Services Act, and particularly by setting new demands for very big platforms like the ones that you are thinking about, very big platforms. So that was the intent. Fighting disinformation, making some advantages, demanding more from companies. Actually, the process is being a little, and Jelena can correct me if I'm wrong, a little disappointing in the sense that right now we are fighting some battles that are not for improving the current status quo, are actually to preventing it from collapsing altogether. Because in this very big piece of legislation, there are so many interests, and as I was saying, with involving huge groups that are much more powerful and have more capacity to influence lawmakers than we are. So, but to be quite honest, at this point, DSA has two main problems. The first one is by design. It only deals with with illicit content, like content that is against the law. That's what the law regulates. But it steers clear of harmful content, which is actually what most of us fact checkers deal with in our day-to-day lives, because nobody really needs to make a strong argument for I don't know, deleting out of a platform a video of child pornography or incitation to violence. It's more, the black and white things are not that difficult. It's harmful content that is difficult. And the DSA proposal as presented by the European Commission have really not gotten into that. But at this point, we have a bigger problem than that. We have an amendment process in the European Parliament with, with the DSA. They are trying to make sure that, for example, digital platforms cannot, they say, interfere with media content, with press publications, which actually means that since, according to European law, anything and everything is a press publication if you want it to be, every major negationist group can claim to be a media outlet, then you cannot really do anything with their content. Meaning, if they are publishing a video claiming that drinking bleach is gonna save you from COVID-19, platforms won't be even able to put a banner there, a disclaimer, a label that says, no, actually drinking bleach is heavily not recommended by doctors. That's the kind of thing we have now in the amendment process. That's an amendment that for real has passed 3 committees in the European Parliament, and we are fighting as of now. So what I intend to convey what I intend to convey is that we went into this process thinking about many ways to make our work more useful, and right now we are kind of fighting some other battles to just save us from going back 10 years to the past.
Thanks for that snapshot. Jelena, could you just give us a very, very brief explanation of why the code is important for fact checkers, and then we'll move to our next presentation from you and Carlos.
Yeah, so basically the DSA and the code are very much connected, because when the DSA is going to be enforceable, then the code is going to be a part of it, sort of with the implementation being monitored. So it's unlike the first code. This one is supposed to be not only stronger in paper, but also in implementation and monitoring. So having in mind that, but let me also stress that the DSA is very important in the sense that even though it's not particularly mentioning fact-checking or fact-checkers, it does say that various researchers need to be granted access to more data. Our fact-checking work also needs to be analyzed to be sure what exactly is our impact, and how to make it more efficient. So the fact-checking per se is actually one specific part of the code. So the guidance of the European Commission that was published before summer actually said that one specific part of the new code needs to be dedicated to fact-checking. And this is where actually we as fact-checkers have quite a big role. If we don't write the suggestions for those measurements and KPIs and what we want, then perhaps somebody else might be doing it, or nobody might be doing it. It's not only about data access, but it's also about gathering our own information to be able to monitor our community as well, and maybe then start discussing about some future codes of our own that Claire Warder was talking about at the beginning of the conference.
Well, thank you both. We've definitely there got an influencing agenda, a lot at stake, fact checkers implicated directly, and also the broader picture. Now, if we're going to influence it, we have to have, I think, a greater sense of who we are as influencers, how we think about ourselves as influencers. And Carlos and Jelena are going to just share a survey now with some of their findings of how the community sees itself as an influencing group.
Yeah, back at the start of the summer, and you can see there, we hand in hand with the IFCN, we decided to survey European fact checkers about what they really wanted about policy, how they saw ourselves in terms of policy, which I think it's like the basic prerogative to go into that debate, like how we see ourselves. Do we see ourselves as capable of having this conversation, of influencing others? And the first slide, if we can see it, it's actually three major figures that we have that define the findings of this survey. As you can see, these three things are that fact checkers pretty much think they have the interest to engage in this process, the knowledge to engage it properly, and also the necessity to do it. I will be very, very clear in that sense. They have the interest because 95.7%, I mean, it's a high percentage. They think public authorities should engage them when defining public policies regarding misinformation online, which is, and not only because they want a seat at the table, because you see that second number there, 87%, that's the number of organizations, of European fact-checking independent organizations that I think through their work, they have been learning interesting, useful lessons that could be very good for defining effective public policies. So that would be the knowledge we can provide to others. And the last time, and that is a very important figure as well, is the necessity. Like 81.8% of organizations in Europe think our community, fact checkers in Europe as a whole, are not well represented in policy discussions at the EU level. So those would be like the three main lines of it. And if we can see the next slide, you can see that it's not, I mean, they want to do more policy work. 78% of those organizations want to do more policy work, but this is sometimes, you know, a problem of resources. If you see of that 78%, which is high, almost 2/3 say they just do not have enough resources to do it. They want, but they cannot because they don't have the time, the skills, that kind of thing. Because the other third says it's just simply no one at their teams is prepared to do it, to engage. Maybe they, you know, in some organizations, maybe no one can actually communicate in these big forums in English, all that stuff. And this is a conversation I have all the time with Jelena about the resources and how important resource allocation is, because we would like to be present in every conversation regarding policy, but we have to pick our fights, right, Jelena?
Or monthly basis, but definitely planning for resources for public advocacy is something that, well, now the whole community is being alerted on the needs and the wishes. Hopefully something can be done about it in the close future. In the meantime, I guess we who have been so far expressing some sort of interest to take part in at least gathering information about what's happening, to be able to decide better on how to invest the small resources that we might have. It seems that we are rather wanted in the discussions, but that it would be great if there would be more of us. And hopefully, I don't know, Carlos, but I was really happy that it seems that there is some energy, sometimes reactions regarding such an amendment that's happening regarding the DSA right now in the parliament. Maybe reactions of the community actually can galvanize the future joint work. I mean, it's one thing to have 1 or 2 or 3 fact checkers in the working groups and stuff, but maybe we might in some time have quite a few of us there. Maybe we can have representations. For example, the Southeastern European Fact-Checking Network, CCHEC. We are trying to organize ourselves for the 5 countries to sort of join lacking resources, and then maybe 10% we get half a person's working time or something like this. But there were discussions on this particular issue on the regional networks panel. Yeah, now I am just happy that this is not completely depressing, the data that Carlos gave to all of us, but there is actually some hope. Well, at least from this perspective.
I think in the same way that the pandemic has been terrible, that has, you know, alerted some people and especially policymakers about the risks of disinformation and misinformation online, it also, some events have galvanized ourselves as well. If we go to the last slide of that presentation, I think we will find that fact checkers, you know, have an interest and also see that they cannot cover everything. Like that 95.7%. They say that we good as a community benefit from having a more unified voice when negotiating with the big guys, policymakers, digital platforms, the kind of actors that we really are smaller than them. But if we get to be a little smart about how we allocate resources, cooperate among ourselves, the very best thing I'm discovering about this crisis, about this amendment in the DSA that you know threatens a lot of things, is how you know, it's galvanizing, as Jelena is saying. It's making a lot of organizations, you know, show up and say, hey, maybe we should work together on this, because if we are not together and try to coordinate, we're going to be drawn in this conversation by bigger actors.
Insights. It's great to know that there's a real willingness and a desire to influence, some clear challenges in doing so, at least in the short term. But I think the beginnings of learning how we might have a common voice where we can do that, how we can cooperate, how we can trust each other to go into a semi-formal or other kinds of alliances. We haven't spoken much about who we can find common cause with. Sometimes, of course, on these big legislative pieces, you can find that the big guys sometimes can be on your side, and on another amendment, perhaps not so. So there's lots of ways we need to learn to influence, but an exciting time to really meet those challenges. Now we're going to circle back, knowing that we're not quite the fighting force that we want to be, but we have lots of resources and intelligence and knowledge to bring to this influencing game. And I want to open back out again to our panelists so that we touch in on what's the state of play now, what is there to fight for, and be a little bit more specific about what's happening now, how people can get involved, what to look out for. I think I'll probably start, since we've just had a presentation with you, Owen, if you'd be happy to speak to us. You're there in Brussels. What's the mood there? What are the battle lines? Where could fact checkers get involved? Thank you.
Sure. So I think on the DSA in particular, it's not easy right now. Like, the European Commission proposed a law in December 2020. I think a lot of folks in the kind of progressive side of the debate were quite happy with that, with the proposal. It had quite a strong, quite effective regulatory architecture. It just needed some tweaks around the edges and some clarifications. However, obviously, as it has gone through the markup phase with the European Parliament and the EU member states, a lot of things have gotten added in there, and the basic regulatory architecture has started to come a little bit undone. And I think Jelena and Carlos have both already mentioned this amendment on media exemptions in terms of service enforcement. That is just one of several different types of amendments which are really kind of complicating the process. At the same time, we're not helped by the fact that the legislative process is moving so quickly. There are effectively arbitrary timelines that this must be completed by. So there's a good chance that we're not going to be able to rectify all of the things, or the kind of the opportunity that the DSA poses in terms of really putting in place the next generation regulatory architecture. That might kind of, in the first instance, pass us by. However, one thing which I think is really important to stress is that the DSA is just going to set a regulatory architecture. It is not going to establish how these things work in practice, particularly on things which are relevant for the fact-checking community, like, for instance, the way the negotiation process with platforms, the ways in which those communication channels are set up, access to data, all of these kind of questions, they're going to be defined and settled afterwards in kind of follow-up technical conversations, such as the Code of Practice on Disinformation and other kind of secondary legislation. And so there is going to be a really, really important opportunity and a very high impact opportunity for the fact-checking community to actually engage, because like, everybody in this community is at the coalface of dealing with these problems. And so those perspectives really do need to be in the room there.
Glen, I think you're mute. It needed to happen.
That was going to happen at some point, wasn't it? I wanted to start bringing in some questions from people who are watching online, for Carlos and Jelena. On this one is, should the IFCN be a vehicle for collective voice? Is there a role for IFCN to be a vehicle for deliberation amongst ourselves, but potentially also an interlocutor with some of the actors? Are there advantages and disadvantages around that? There's certainly interest from the viewing audience here on that question. Maybe you could pick that up in your next remarks. Jelena, maybe I can come to you first.
Regarding the future role of IFCN in this, I don't know about the current role, but what I know is that the deadlines in front of us are such that in a month or a month and a half, basically the code of conduct should be written, published, and first signatories should already be there. So I think it's a question of the next few weeks that the code is going to be written or not, with fact checkers in the working group. And then the DSA, that's what happening already. I mean, Then there's a whole other group of regulation and legislation and action plans on democracy and on media and on the budget and like so many other stuff. Yeah, it would be great if fact checkers had their own public policy department. Yeah, that would be great to gather research, knowledge, lessons learned, and to be able to share not only with institutions that can be making decisions on public policies, but also with other researchers and whoever, the public, the general public. But I'm not sure that we have, that the European Union is going to wait for us to organize ourselves much better than we are at this moment.
A part of what Jelena was saying was exactly on point. Like some of these debates, most of these debates are going to happen no matter what, no matter if we are prepared or not, if we want to engage or not, if we would like them to be a little different in process. So that's, well, there is this saying in Spanish that I cannot translate very well. That is like, when you see that space, that's a space that you've lost forever, right? So I think it's important to be there, even to be able to sometimes walk out the door in outrage about the result. As for the IFCN being the conduit for that, and I think the IFCN is wonderful in the sense that it provides standards for all of us that make sure that the organizations calling themselves fact checkers are actually quality information organizations, quality journalism being done. I think if we with the contacts we have with our own members of the European Parliament in Brussels, when you are in the European Union, and with the kind of cultural adjustment and knowledge we have, if we sometimes find hard to get into this process, that's gonna be much harder for the IFCN actual structure in Florida. I think it's probably better that we do our get our staff community together through the IFCN, but make sure we can have representation there that can also divide the workload in a smart way, because sometimes for only one organization, be that the IFCN or any other European fact checkers, it's going to be very difficult to carry the workload of this long process. But if we kind of manage among ourselves, you go today and tomorrow and you report back and that stuff, that's how I envision most of this stuff, like doing what we can with what we have.
Thank you, Carlos. I also, to add in a thought on my side as well, I was struck earlier, you spoke about the loophole around media organizations that's emerging. And we too in the UK have got a loophole proposed in the online safety bill, where there's a free pass given to media organizations to not come under the regulation, and also a very, very fuzzy description of who is a journalist. Obviously, this is going to really not help in the fight against harmful misinformation. But it seemed to me that it speaks to importance for us to have a dialogue across the different legislative areas about what's happening, what's the best outcome, how we can make sure that we're raising the bar everywhere rather than fighting fires everywhere. You also mentioned earlier that the DSA is largely about illegal content. And the interesting thing in the UK is harmful content to adults is also within the legislation. So there's a really interesting comparison and a lot to press for. And the reason I mentioned that, we've got a question coming in around gender-based violence. And what we've found in the UK is that the fact that there's legal but harmful content to adults within the legislative framework means that we can find common cause with others who are working on racial abuse, gender-based abuse as well, and others. And I just wondered how that plays in, if not directly, but how is the fact-checking influence playing out with others who have societal outcomes that they're looking for? Who might we line up with in civil society in common cause in the wider fight for a better information environment? I'm happy to let anybody come in on that if you want to, one way or the other. But I'm interested in your answer on that one.
I don't know if I have like a very complete answer, but my thoughts on that are always that when you talk about, and this goes exactly to the core of the problem of defining harmful content, but also serves for other major debates like defining what's a media outlet, right? If we, those kind of principles have to come from a big, wide social consensus, and we advocate for that consensus about what's harmful. For example, that cannot be said in an office in Palo Alto, California, by 4 people that we don't know, and that we don't know which kind of data they are looking at when they make that decision, or even if they are looking at some data. So this kind of effort, and I like the way you phrase it, this as to how to engage with other actors. If we need to maybe think about ways to act against harmful content, we need to define what's harmful. And to define what's harmful, that cannot be done if not by a very big open process with academia and fact checkers, and obviously public institutions, but also third sector and civil society and so many others. Because if we don't have that kind of process to define those big issues, even at the European level, but also national, we won't be able to have the credibility to then act on the decisions we have made regarding what's harmful and what's not. So when you phrase it this as to how to engage, that I like it a lot, because the same way that I demand a place for us at the table when the conversation is about disinformation, I want to make sure that at some other tables there are other experts that know more about some issues that I do. And that has a lot to do, for example, with hate crimes, crime speech, that kind of thing. These things have to come out of big consensus in society, or they don't have any public support, and they are always suspect from being censorship or other things that make those issues or those regulations ineffectual.
Jelena, does this throw up any thoughts on your side?
Well, I would say that the first step would be to define our own values and how much we share them. And through those values, and this is the approach that the European Commission has also taken in writing the DSA, through those values, we can find possible partners or coalitions. If we view human rights in the digital sphere as digital human rights, then perhaps the set of stakeholders who we might be in principle aligned with might become more clear to us. I guess that there might be supporters in other sectors as well, but also that within our media journalism wider sectors, we might also need to listen to all the stakeholders with their own views and perspective. And perhaps if we would sometimes be on the opposite sides, doesn't mean that in conversation, in dialogue, we would not find a joint solution that might be better. I'm not sure if you're catching what I mean, but the point is, it's so much work. It's so easy to fail, in the sense, if you don't understand what's really happening, who is really doing what, and for what reasons, intervention to the legislative processes might even not necessarily be positive. So I would say that first, what we need to do, in my own organization and partner circle, we need to make sure that we ourselves are ready for this, in the sense that we are ready to gather information, learn from others, share our own information, and then have evidence-based public advocacy approach to the legislation and the co-regulation and self-regulation that is going to be happening. So we have quite a lot of basic work to be done individually. For starters, allocating time for dealing with this.
Yeah, I think that's a good and strong key message, isn't it? This is important. We've all got limited constraints. Not all of us have policy or advocacy roles, but we do need to find the capacity to engage. Owen, over to you. What are some of the key messages now about what's about to happen, and who we go into battle with, as it were?
It's not an easy question, but I think in general, just to pick up a little bit on what was just said in the previous question, like a major shortcoming people have identified with the DSA and kind of a lot of the EU legislative initiatives in this space is that they are focused exclusively on illegal content, and that is a fair criticism. But to be honest, when I think about us looking back in, say, 5 years' time at these legislative processes, I actually think that we're going to look back on this and think actually one of the best innovations with the DSA was how it addressed some of the problems with harmful content. And that might sound a bit counterintuitive, but my thinking here is that if you look at many of the things that are harmful today, and like very often, like as Carlos mentioned, these things are really hard to define. And to be honest, even with getting everybody around the table, civil society, academics, lawmakers, I don't think one is ever going to be able to come up with meaningful, workable definitions of harmful content. And the reason is that very often it's just so context dependent. In the online sphere, it depends on like who sees the content, under what circumstances, and how many people see that content. And I think in the fact-checking context, this is probably quite pertinent. For instance, if you have a relationship with an online platform and you are fact-checking a certain amount of content every day, it's natural that one will prioritize content which has a high degree of reach or which is being distributed by, say, public figures. And the fact that the DSA is starting, through its articles on like risk management and risk mitigation and so forth, is starting to look at these design factors and the ways in which platforms are designed, the way in which they operate themselves, and the way in which they respond to risks. That could be the kind of innovation where we start to see like really meaningful progress in addressing some of these issues. And I think it does apply also to the previous question about gender-based online violence. Like there is a large initiative in the European Parliament, and we are part of this, to try and ensure that the risk management measures in the DSA purposely aim at identifying, evaluating, and managing the risk of gender-based online violence, because very often these things are a function and can be addressed through system design and system tweaks. And so I think that's going to be the big area of progress that we can make over the next couple of months.
Thank you, Ryan. And I was intrigued there by you speaking out to a 5-year horizon. And I think all of us know that this is not just a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year, 20-year project. And this will just be one of many laws and regulations that emerge and get iterated. And so it's quite difficult to see where this will go. But I wanted to ask Carlos and Jelena, where in a year's time at Global Fact 9, what would you be happy with in terms of progress made? What is just some sense for you about where we might be in a year's time if we are able to advocate well? And I also just wanted you, Art, to let those viewing online how they can connect in with this work. What's the best way to find out what's going on? Just to end out our messages of connection. And certainly at Full Fact, we're happy to speak to anybody looking at regulation around the world so that we can learn and share. So just a quick 10 seconds each of one thing you'd like to see in a year and how people can get involved.
Yeah, 20 seconds and I already lost 5. So no, what I was going to say, in a year, I would love for us to have, that the Digital Services Act that will not be implemented yet, but this is not a complete disaster, and a code of practice on disinformation that actually looks like the guidance that the European Commission itself set for it, like better cooperation with fact-checking organizations, clear data with access for academics and also fact-checkers, the kind of thing they went into this process trying to achieve. If only by the bar the Commission set themselves, it would be wonderful. That would be great. And also that we engage with YouTube, for example, which is doing a mess of many things. And you have another panel about that. If you are at all interested about that, contact Maldita or Jelena at Faktograf or Full Fact. Please engage. This is the most important thing I have to say.
That's brilliant. Well, good luck to everybody's engaging and influencing. Thank you so much to our panel. Thank you for everybody watching online. Coming up in about 15 minutes, we're talking about media literacy.